Eleanor Whitmore pressed her trembling hand flat against the cold window of the train carriage, watching the only world she had ever known disappear behind her like smoke. She was not crying. She had made herself a promise the night before she would not cry. Not for the sisters who laughed as they packed her trunk. Not for the mother who said nothing. Not for the town that had spent 25 years looking straight through her. She pressed her palm harder against the glass. Let it go, she told herself. All of it, let it go. But the thing about pain is that it does not leave just because you tell it to. Before we go any further, if this story speaks to something inside you, something you have carried quietly and never said out loud, I want you to hit that subscribe button right now. Drop your city in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels, because Eleanor's story deserves to be heard all the way to the edges of this country. And you deserve to hear every single word of it. Now let's go back to the beginning, because the beginning is where everything that mattered started breaking apart. Franklin, Missouri was a town that believed it understood people. It categorized them the way a merchant categorizes goods by value, by appearance, by usefulness. And by the summer of 1885, it had categorized Eleanor Whitmore completely and without apology. She was the plain one. Not ugly, they would say quickly, in that careful way people use to make cruelty sound like honesty. Not unpleasant, not without value, just plain ordinary. The kind of woman who fades into the wallpaper of a room the moment someone more interesting walks through the door. Her sisters, Vivian and Rosalie, had never faded into anything in their lives. Vivian was 28 and had the kind of beauty that made men forget what they were saying mid-sentence. She had married well, married fast, and spent the years since letting everyone know it. Rosalie was 22, with soft golden curls and a laugh that filled rooms, and she had already turned down 2 proposals because neither man was wealthy enough to satisfy what she believed she deserved. And then there was Eleanor. Eleanor, who was 25 and had never been proposed to at all. Eleanor, who spent her evenings reading agricultural journals and farm ledgers, instead of needlework and romantic novels. Eleanor, who knew the difference between a healthy livestock contract and one designed to cheat a buyer. Eleanor, whose hands were not soft because she had spent years quietly doing the work that kept the Whitmore household running, while her sisters practiced smiling in mirrors. Nobody in Franklin talked about those things. They talked about what they could see. And what they saw when they looked at Eleanor Whitmore was a woman who would likely die in her father's house, caring for aging parents, watching her sister's children grow up, and never once being chosen. That was the story Franklin had written for her. She had not yet decided whether she believed it. The advertisement appeared in the Franklin Gazette on a Tuesday morning in July, tucked between a notice about a church fundraiser and a listing for farm equipment. Wanted, a practical wife for a widowed ranch owner in the Montana Territory. The right woman must be hardworking, honest, and capable of managing a household under frontier conditions. A young child is part of the arrangement. Beauty is not the requirement. Character is. Interested parties may write to G. Callahan Ranch, Helena, Montana Territory. Rosalie found it first. She read it aloud at the breakfast table with the tone of someone reading a particularly funny joke at a party. A mail-order bride, she said, setting down her coffee cup with a little click. Can you imagine? Shipping yourself off to Montana like a piece of furniture. Vivian looked up from her toast. Who would do such a thing? Someone desperate, Rosalie said. Someone who had absolutely no other options. She paused. Her eyes drifted across the table to where Eleanor sat with her own coffee and a copy of a farming report she'd been studying since before the others had come downstairs. The look passed between Vivian and Rosalie like a lit match. Eleanor did not look up from her reading, but she heard it. She always heard everything. Eleanor, Vivian said sweetly. Don't you think that sounds like an interesting opportunity? Eleanor turned a page. For whom? For someone who enjoys managing a household, Rosalie said. And doesn't mind rough conditions. And isn't, particularly looking for romance. Said Eleanor. She took a sip of her coffee. She set it down. She turned another page. She heard her sisters exchange another glance, and she knew with the particular precision of a woman who has spent her entire life being underestimated by people she loves, exactly what they were planning. She said nothing, she simply waited. What she did not expect was the speed of it. That same afternoon, while Eleanor was in the back garden helping the cook sort through dried herbs, Vivian sat down at the small writing desk in the parlor and composed a letter. She wrote it in Eleanor's name. She described Eleanor the way she always described her, with a kind of thoughtless accuracy that functioned like a knife. She wrote that Eleanor was not beautiful, that she was practical, that she was experienced with household management and numbers and had never attracted much attention from the men of Franklin. She wrote that Eleanor was, in essence, exactly what the advertisement was looking for. She sealed it. She posted it herself, and then both sisters waited for the silence they were certain would come in return. It did not come. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at the Whitmore house addressed to Miss Eleanor Whitmore in a firm, unhurried hand. Rosalie found it in the Morning Post and read it before Eleanor came downstairs. By the time Eleanor appeared in the hallway in her plain gray dress with her dark hair pinned back, Rosalie was already in the parlor with Vivian. And the two of them were looking at each other with an expression that had shifted from amusement into something more complicated. "You have a letter," Vivian said. Eleanor looked at her sister's face, then at Rosalie's, then at the envelope sitting on the side table. She picked it up. She read the return address. She looked up. "Which one of you wrote to him?" she asked. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Eleanor sat down in the nearest chair and opened the letter. Grant Callahan wrote the way Eleanor suspected he lived, directly, without wasted words, without performance. He thanked whoever had written on Eleanor's behalf for the honest description. He said he had received dozens of letters from women describing themselves as beautiful and charming and eager for adventure, and he had thrown most of them away because he did not need beautiful or charming. He needed capable. He needed honest. He needed someone who understood that the Montana Territory was not a romantic story and that his life was not a fairy tale. He said he had a son named Samuel who was 7 years old and still grieving a mother he had lost too young. He said the ranch was successful, but the house was empty in ways that success could not fix. He said he was not offering love. He was offering respect, security, and a partnership between two people who understood the value of honesty. And then he said something that Eleanor read 3 times before she put the letter down. "If you are willing to come, I believe you are exactly who I have been looking for. Not because of what they said you lack, but because of what they said you are." Eleanor sat very still. Outside the parlor window, she could hear a sparrow in the garden. She could hear Vivian shift in her chair. She could hear the clock on the mantel counting the seconds. "Well," said Rosalie finally in a voice that had lost most of its humor. "You're not actually going to go." Eleanor folded the letter carefully. She looked at her sisters. "Why not?" she said. The morning Eleanor left Franklin, the whole town seemed to know. She had not told anyone except her parents, but Franklin was the kind of town where news traveled like fire through dry grass, and by 7 in the morning, there were women on the street who stopped to watch her walk to the station with her single trunk and her small traveling bag, and the looks on their faces were not kind. Some of them were surprised. Some of them were amused. One woman, a neighbor, Mrs. Garrett, who had known Eleanor since childhood, actually stepped forward and said, in a tone of genuine concern that managed to sound like pity, "Eleanor, dear, are you certain about this? A mail-order arrangement in Montana." Eleanor stopped. She looked at Mrs. Garrett. "Yes," she said. "I'm certain." Mrs. Garrett pressed her lips together in the way people do when they have more to say and have decided it would be rude to say it. But her eyes said it anyway. They said, "You are making a fool of yourself. You are running toward rejection. You are going to fail out there and come home worse off than you left." Eleanor picked up her traveling bag. She walked to the station. She did not look back. The train journey west was 4 days and 3 nights of country that changed from the green rolling hills of Missouri into something wider and wilder and more indifferent than anything she had prepared herself for. She sat at the window for hours at a time, watching the landscape flatten and expand, watching the sky become enormous, watching the world she knew become smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. She was frightened. She would not have admitted it to anyone, but she was genuinely frightened, not of Grant Callahan, not of the ranch, not of frontier life. She was frightened of her own hope. She had spent so many years making herself comfortable with low expectations that this small, stubborn hope she was carrying felt dangerous. Like something she could not afford to drop and could not afford to hold too tightly. She read. She studied. She had brought 3 books, 2 on household management and 1 slim volume on cattle ranching in the Western Territories that she had purchased quietly from the Franklin bookseller 2 days before she left. She read all 3 before the train reached Kansas. She wrote in her journal every morning. She did not write about fear. She wrote about what she observed, the names of the towns the train passed through, the quality of the light at different hours, the way the land smelled different west of the Missouri River. She wrote down facts because facts were solid and she needed something solid to hold on to. On the 3rd day, a woman sat down across from her in the dining car and introduced herself as Mrs. Catherine Holt, traveling to join her husband who worked for a mining company in Colorado. She was perhaps 50, with weathered hands and a direct gaze, and she looked at Eleanor the way people rarely looked at her, as though she were genuinely interesting. "You're heading west for the first time," Mrs. Holt said. It was not a question. "Is it that obvious?" Eleanor asked. "You've got your nose in a cattle ranching book," the woman said, "and you've got the look of somebody making peace with a decision they already know they're not going to change." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. Then she laughed, a small surprise sound, because she had not expected to laugh. "I'm going to marry a rancher," she said, "in Montana." Mrs. Holt nodded slowly. "Do you know him?" "No. Do you want to?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "I want to build something," she said finally. "I want to be somewhere that needs what I actually have. Not what I'm supposed to pretend to have." Mrs. Holt was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Montana will need everything you have. And probably a few things you don't know you have yet." She patted Eleanor's hand once firmly like a benediction. "Good luck to you, young woman." Grant Callahan was standing at the station when the train pulled into Helena. Eleanor recognized him before he could have recognized her. The letter had not contained a physical description that had seemed like an oversight at the time, but standing on the platform watching the crowd, she understood it as something else. He was looking for her the same way she was looking for him. Not by appearance, by something less easy to describe. He was tall, broader than she had expected. He wore a gray work shirt and a dark coat, and his hat was pushed back slightly on his head in the way of a man who had worn hats for decades and no longer thought about them. He had a short beard, brown hair going to gray at the temples, and the weathered face of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. He was scanning the platform with eyes that were steady and serious and not unkind. Eleanor walked toward him with her trunk being carried by the station hand and her traveling bag over her own arm. She stopped 3 feet away. "Mr. Callahan," she said. He looked at her. Something passed across his face, not disappointment, she thought. More like recognition, like a man confirming something he already suspected. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes." He reached out and took her traveling bag from her arm before she had decided whether to offer it. Not aggressively, just efficiently, the way a person moves when they are accustomed to solving the immediate problem in front of them. "How was the journey?" he asked. "Long," she said. "Yes," he said. They stood there for a moment, 2 strangers assessing each other with the particular honesty of people who have already agreed to stop pretending. "I have to tell you something," Eleanor said, because she had decided on the train that she would say this immediately, before anything else. "The letter that was written on my behalf, I didn't write it." Grant looked at her. "I know," he said. She blinked. "You know, the handwriting was different from your reply." She had written a short reply, 2 paragraphs, accepting his invitation and asking 2 practical questions about the ranch's water situation and the nearest physician to the property. She had not thought about the handwriting. "I didn't reply to who wrote the first letter," Grant said, with a directness that she found immediately steadying. "I replied to who wrote back." Eleanor looked at him for another moment. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. They walked to the wagon. The ride to Callahan Ranch took 2 hours on a road that was dust and ruts, and the occasional spectacular view of mountains that made Eleanor feel, for the first time in her life, genuinely small. Not in the way Franklin made her feel small, in a different way. In a way that felt almost like relief, as though the world was large enough that her size didn't matter. Grant drove and spoke when there was something useful to say, and was silent when there wasn't. She found this comfortable in a way she had not expected. He told her about the ranch, 1,200 acres. 300 cattle, a main house, 4 outbuildings, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and a kitchen garden that had been badly managed for the past year and needed attention. He told her about Samuel, that the boy was quiet, that he was smart, that he had nightmares sometimes and would not explain them, and that the last woman who had been hired to help with the house had left after 2 months because the frontier winters were not what she expected. "I'm not telling you these things to discourage you," Grant said. "I'm telling you because you should know what you're walking into." "I appreciate that," Eleanor said. He glanced at her sideways. "Most people don't like that kind of directness. Most people find it easier to be surprised," she said. "I prefer to be prepared." He looked at the road ahead for a moment. "Good," he said. The ranch appeared as they came over a low rise in the land, and Eleanor's first sight of it was the main house, 2 stories, solid and square and built to last, with a wide porch and glass windows that caught the late afternoon light. Behind it, the barn and the outbuildings were arranged with practical efficiency, and the land stretched out in every direction in the particular way of Montana, as though the horizon was not a boundary but a suggestion. She did not say anything, she simply looked. Grant pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down, and when he reached up to help her down, he did it without ceremony, one hand steady, and let go the moment her feet were on the ground. Standing in the yard, Eleanor looked at the house. At the porch, at the windows, at the enormous quiet of the place. And then the front door opened, and a small boy appeared. Samuel Callahan was 7 years old, dark-haired like his father, with eyes that were too old for his face. He stood on the top porch step and looked at Eleanor with an expression that was not hostile, exactly, but was watchful in a way that made her think of a young animal deciding whether something was safe. Samuel said, "Come say hello." Samuel came down the steps slowly. He stopped 2 feet from Eleanor and looked up at her. "Hello," he said. "Hello," she said. "Are you going to live here?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He thought about that. "For how long?" Eleanor crouched down so she was eye level with him. It was an instinct, not a calculation. She looked at him directly, at the old eyes, the careful posture, the hands that were gripped together in front of him. "For a long time," she said, "if you'll have me." Samuel studied her face with the thoroughness of a child who has learned not to trust quickly. "Mama died," he said. "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm very sorry." "Are you trying to be my new mama?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Behind her she could feel Grant go very still. "No," she said honestly. "I'm not trying to be anything except someone who is here. Someone who will stay. What that means is something we'd have to figure out together." "If you want to." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his father. Then he looked back at Eleanor. "There are 4 cats in the barn," he said, "but one of them scratches." "I appreciate the warning," Eleanor said. Something shifted in Samuel's face, not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the space where one might eventually grow. "Okay," he said, and he turned and went back inside. Eleanor straightened up and turned to find Grant watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "That's the longest conversation he's had with a stranger in a year," he said. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. He picked up her trunk. "I'll show you the house," he said. The first 2 weeks at Callahan Ranch were, in their own way, the most honest period of Eleanor's life. There was no pretending here. There was no performance. Every morning she woke before dawn and made herself useful, because usefulness was the one currency she had always had and never been allowed to spend. She learned the kitchen before she learned the parlor. She learned the supply ledgers before she learned the names of all the ranch hands. She found 3 separate accounting errors in the ranch's contract with the main supply merchant in Helena, errors that had cost Grant money for 2 solid years without anyone noticing. She put the corrected figures on his desk without saying anything about them. He found them that evening. He came to find her where she was sitting at the kitchen table, working through the household accounts by lamplight, and he stood in the doorway with the corrected ledger pages in his hand. "You found these," he said. "Yes," she said, without looking up from her current work. "You didn't say anything. I didn't think I needed to." She finished her calculation, set down her pen, and looked up at him. "I put them where you'd see them." He looked at the pages. Then at her. "This is 2 years of overcharges, significant ones." "Yes, Everett Marsh has been supplying this ranch for 6 years. I'm aware he may not have done it intentionally." She paused. "But I'd recommend confirming the next contract in person." Grant was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn to read a supply contract?" he asked. "I taught myself," she said. "I had access to my father's business accounts. Nobody thought I was interested in them. That made it easy to learn." He looked at her steadily. In the lamplight, his face was still difficult to read. It was always difficult to read, but something in his posture had changed. Something had recalibrated. "Why didn't anyone in Franklin know you could do this?" he said. Eleanor looked at her hands, looked at the pen she'd set down. Looked back up at him. "Because nobody asked," she said simply. He put the ledger pages on the table beside her work. "I'm asking," he said. And that quiet, direct, unadorned sentence was the moment the arrangement began to become something else. Not love, not yet, not even something she had a name for. But a recognition. The kind that happens between 2 people who have spent a long time being invisible in different ways, and suddenly find themselves seen. The ranch hands' names were Tom Barker, Pete Sullivan, Denny Flores, and an older man everyone called Hat because he wore the same battered straw hat regardless of weather or season. They had all been at Callahan Ranch for at least 3 years. They were loyal to Grant in the particular way of men who have worked for a fair employer and know the difference. They were not unkind to Eleanor, but they were waiting. She saw it in the way they watched her when she came into the yard, the way conversations paused when she appeared, the way they glanced at each other when she asked questions about the cattle operation. They were waiting to see whether she would last, whether she would survive the first hard frost, whether she would turn out to be another one of the women from the East who arrived with ideals and left with broken illusions. She understood their skepticism. She would have felt the same. So she did not argue with it. She did not demand their trust. She simply kept working, kept learning, kept showing up before dawn and staying after dark, and let time do what time does, which is reveal the truth of a person regardless of what everyone expected. Hat was the first one. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks after her arrival, when 2 of the cattle in the north pasture showed signs of something that was making Eleanor uneasy. She had been reading about cattle diseases on the train. She recognized the pattern, the way the animals were holding themselves, the redness around their eyes, the decreased movement. She found Hat repairing a fence at the edge of the property, and she walked directly to him and said, "The 2 brown ones in the north pasture. The ones near the eastern fence line. I think something's wrong with them, and I think it might spread." Hat looked at her from under his battered hat with the expression of a man who has heard many opinions from people who did not know what they were talking about. "What kind of wrong?" he said. She told him what she'd observed. Exactly, without embellishment. Hat went still. Then he pushed back the brim of his hat and looked toward the north pasture. "You sure about what you saw?" he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll go look," he said. He went. He came back an hour later and found Grant, not Eleanor. But Eleanor was in the kitchen, and she heard through the open window what Hat said. She was right. Might have caught it in time, might not have. Grant's voice lower. "Who told you?" A pause. "Miss Whitmore." Another pause. Then Grant, get Denny and separate those two from the rest of the herd. She heard Hat's boots on the gravel, walking back toward the pasture. She heard Grant come to stand just outside the kitchen door. He did not come in, but after a moment he said, "Good catch," in a voice pitched for her ears and nobody else's. She was stirring something on the stove. "Thank you," she said. And that, quietly, without ceremony, was how it began. The beginning of trust, the beginning of belonging. The beginning of something neither of them had expected, and both of them desperately needed. But the beginning was the easy part. What was coming, what neither of them knew yet, was that someone else had been watching Callahan Ranch for a long time. Someone who understood that Grant Callahan's land was worth more than Grant Callahan knew. Someone who had been patient and careful and cruel in the slow, deliberate way of men who never use force when manipulation is available. His name was Harlan Voss, and he was already moving. But that storm gathering on the edge of the Montana horizon was something Eleanor would have to face before she had finished learning who she was on this land, before Samuel had finished deciding whether he could love her, before Grant had finished understanding what he felt every time he looked up from his work and found her there, steady, present, and entirely unlike anyone he had ever expected to let inside his life. She did not know yet what was coming. She only knew what she could see. And what she could see on those early Montana mornings when the light came in long and golden across the plains and the ranch smelled like hay and cold air and the distant cattle, was a life that was finally hers. Not the life Franklin had written for her, not the joke her sisters had sent her into. Her own life, hard-edged and honest and enormous, stretching out ahead of her like the Montana sky farther than she could see, and full of more than she had ever dared to want. She was not going to waste a single day of it. Harlan Voss came to Callahan Ranch on a Thursday. Eleanor was in the supply room off the kitchen, working through the inventory ledger, when she heard the sound of horses in the yard, and then voices, Grant's voice, low and controlled, and another voice she did not recognize. A voice that was smooth in the way of something that had been deliberately smoothed, the way river stones are smooth not because they were made that way, but because something wore them down over a long time. She set down her pen. She did not go to the window. She listened. "I'm not here to argue with you, Grant," the smooth voice said. "I'm here as a neighbor, as someone who has known you for years. The offer I'm making is generous. You know it's generous." "I know what the land is worth," Grant said. "Do you?" A pause. A pause that felt like a smile, because I'm not sure you do. I'm not sure you've had the time lately to pay attention to what's been changing in this territory. I pay attention to my ranch, of course you do. The smooth voice softened slightly, the way a blade softens when it turns sideways. And it's a fine ranch, nobody disputes that, but a ranch is only as secure as its water rights, Grant. You know that better than anyone. A silence. Eleanor's hand had gone very still on the ledger. Water rights. She had read about water rights on the train. She had read about them in the agricultural journals she'd been studying for 2 weeks. She knew exactly what those 2 words meant in the Montana Territory in 1885, which was to say she knew they meant everything. Without water rights, cattle operations collapsed. Without water, the land was worthless. And if someone were trying to threaten a ranch's water access quietly, legally, through paperwork and influence a rancher who was not watching the right documents might not notice until it was too late. She picked up her pen. She set it down again. She got up from her stool and walked to the doorway of the kitchen, which gave her a view of the porch through the half-open front door, and she looked at Harlan Voss for the first time. He was perhaps 55, heavy-set in a well-dressed way, wearing a coat that was too fine for a casual Thursday visit to a neighboring ranch. He had gray hair and a square face and the particular kind of smile that lives entirely in the lower half of the face and never reaches the eyes. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his weight settled back on his heels, and everything about his posture said, "I already know how this ends." "I'll think about it," Grant said. His voice had no warmth in it. "Of course," Voss said. "Take your time, there's no urgency." He said the word urgency the way a man says it when he wants you to know there is enormous urgency and he has already accounted for your response to it. Give my regards to the household. His eyes moved as he said it, a single sliding glance toward the front door, toward where Eleanor was standing. She did not step back. She met his gaze directly, the way a woman does when she has decided she is not going to be made invisible in her own home. Something shifted in Voss's expression, barely, like a card turning over in a deck. He looked away and walked back toward his horse, and a moment later the sound of hooves was moving away from the ranch. Grant came inside. He found Eleanor standing in the kitchen doorway. "You heard," he said, "most of it." He pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down and put his hands flat on the table in front of him. Which she had come to understand in the past weeks was what Grant Callahan did when he was thinking hard about something he didn't want to say out loud. "He's been after the South Parcel for 3 years," Grant said. "The South Parcel," Eleanor said. "That's where the creek runs." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "and the creek feeds the water system for the north and east pastures." "Yes." Eleanor sat down across from him when he mentioned water rights. Was that a specific reference or a general one? Grant's jaw tightened slightly. "I'm not sure. I think we should find out." She said it directly without softening it. "I'd like to look at your water rights documentation. Whatever you have in the files. And I want to look at anything you have on recent filings in the county." Grant looked at her for a moment. "You think he's already making a move?" "I think a man like that doesn't make social visits on Thursday afternoons to talk about generosity." She paused. "I think he told you what he wanted you to hear, and I think what he actually came to assess was whether anyone here would notice what he's already doing." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people arriving at the same place by different roads. "The files are in the study," Grant said. "Top drawer of the cabinet on the left." She was already standing up. She spent that evening in the study with 3 years of county filing documents, 2 ledgers, and the original water rights deed for Callahan Ranch spread across the desk. And she read every word of every page with the particular focus of a woman who has spent her whole life being told she was looking at things that didn't concern her. Grant came in at 9 o'clock with 2 cups of coffee and set one beside her without being asked, and looked at what she'd spread out on the desk. "Anything," he said. "Not yet," she said. "But look at this." She pointed to a line in a county filing from 8 months prior. "This is a water usage claim filed by a corporation, Voss Land Holdings. The creek that runs through your South Parcel is named here. Not as a contested source, just named, listed as an ancillary water source." Grant leaned over to read it. "That doesn't mean anything by itself," he said. "No," Eleanor agreed. "By itself it doesn't. But it means someone has already started creating a paper record. A foundation." She sat back and looked at the document. "If he files another claim, if he documents any kind of usage right on that creek, and if that claim goes in front of a county judge before you contest it, your water rights become a legal argument instead of a settled fact." Grant was very still. "He'd need to demonstrate it," she said slowly. "Has anyone been on the South Parcel that you know of? Anyone who might have been accessing the creek?" Grant straightened up. He looked at the wall above the desk. She watched him searching his memory. She could see it in the tightening around his eyes, the slight movement in his jaw. "Last spring," he said. "Tom mentioned seeing riders on the south fence line. I thought they were just passing through. Surveymen for the railway, maybe." Eleanor looked at him. "What if they weren't?" she said quietly. The room went very still, and in that stillness, something shifted between them, a shared understanding. The weight of something serious being acknowledged between two people who are now undeniably in it together, and Eleanor felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She had not come to Montana to fight a land dispute. But she had come here to be useful, and she was becoming more certain by the hour that this was precisely what useful looked like. The next morning she asked Grant to take her to the South Parcel. Tom Barker drove them in the work wagon, and Hat came along because Hat went almost everywhere and seemed to have an instinct for when his presence was necessary. The morning was cold and clear, and the land in the south section was rougher than the main ranch, cut through by the creek that gave it its value, a good strong creek, clear running, fed by snowmelt from the mountains. Eleanor walked along the bank. She was not looking at the water. She was looking at the ground. There, she said. Hat leaned over. Tom Barker came to look. In the soft earth beside the creek, partially overgrown but still distinct if you were looking for them, were the marks of a stake. A survey stake, long since pulled, but the hole it had left was still there, and beside it, if you knew what you were looking at, the faint remnants of a marker flag. Someone surveyed this, Tom said. Someone documented a presence here, Eleanor corrected, because she was thinking about how this would look in front of a judge. Which is different from a survey. A survey has to be registered. This was something smaller, something quiet. Grant crouched beside the hole. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he stood up and looked at Eleanor. "How do we stop it?" he said. "We file first," she said immediately. "We document everything we can show about existing usage, your cattle's water access, years of records, any historical documentation you have on the creek. We make the record so complete and so clear that there is no gap for a secondary claim to fit into." She paused. "But we need to do it quickly, before he files again." "I'll need a lawyer," Grant said. "Yes, but you'll need the right documentation first, or the lawyer has nothing to work with." She was already thinking ahead, already organizing what they had and what they needed, and the familiar feeling of solving a problem, the precise, satisfying click of a mind, working through a real challenge, was moving through her like something she'd been waiting years to feel. "Give me 2 more days with the files. I'll have everything organized for whoever you bring in." Hat, who had been standing quietly to one side this whole time, watching the creek and watching Eleanor with his weathered face tilted slightly, said without looking at either of them, "She's right, you know." Grant looked at him. Hat shrugged, the way Hat did everything, as though the gesture had been distilled down to only its necessary components. "Just saying." Tom Barker looked at Eleanor with something different in his expression than she'd seen from him before. Not the careful waiting she was used to from the ranch hands. Something closer to assessment, reassessment. They drove back to the ranch. That evening after supper, when Samuel had gone to bed and Grant was in the study, and the house had settled into its quiet working rhythm, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and wrote out a complete summary of everything she had found, every document, every filing, every discrepancy, organized in the order a lawyer would need to read it. She worked until past midnight. When she finally set down her pen, she sat back and looked at what she'd produced, and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Not pride exactly, something quieter than pride, the simple bedrock satisfaction of knowing she had done something well. Something that mattered, something nobody else here could have done. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. And across the hallway, behind the closed door of the study, Grant Callahan sat looking at the summary she had left on the desk, which she had slid under the door without knocking, not wanting to disturb him, and he read it once, and then again. And then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. In the morning, before anyone else was awake, he came downstairs and found Eleanor already in the kitchen with the coffee on and the household accounts open in front of her. And he stood in the doorway the way he sometimes did, and he said, "Eleanor." She looked up. "Thank you," he said. It came out slightly rough, the way words do when they are carrying more weight than their speaker intended to put on them. She looked at him steadily. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just let me help." He held her gaze for a moment longer than he usually did. "All right," he said, and he sat down across from her and poured himself coffee, and they worked through the morning plans together, side by side in the early light, and neither of them said anything else about it. But something had changed. Something had quietly and irrevocably changed. It was Rosalie's letter that arrived 3 weeks later and broke something open that Eleanor had been managing to keep closed. She recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately. She stood in the front hallway holding it for a moment before she opened it, and she gave herself that moment, deliberately, one moment, to be whatever she needed to be before she read the words, because she already knew. In the way you know things that you'd rather not know, that the words were not going to be kind. She was right. The letter was 2 pages long. It was written in Rosalie's quick, careless hand with its decorative loops, and it said things that were dressed up in concern but were functionally cruelty. It said that everyone in Franklin was talking about Eleanor's situation. It said that people were calling it sad. It said that a marriage of convenience to a man in the wilderness was not a life but a last resort, and that, even now, if Eleanor came home, the family would receive her without judgment. It said in its final paragraph that the rancher had obviously chosen her because he had no other options, and that Eleanor should be careful not to mistake his practicality for something more than it was. "Don't build a life on a man's desperation," Rosalie had written. "It will only hurt worse when it falls apart." Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully. She put it in her apron pocket. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter for a moment, with her hands braced against the edge of the wood, looking at nothing, and she let the words move through her the way you let cold air move through a room, not fighting it. Not pretending it wasn't there, just letting it pass. She was still standing there when Samuel came in through the back door, muddy from the yard, carrying something cupped in both hands. "Miss Eleanor," he said, "look." She turned. He opened his hands carefully to show her a small bird, a young sparrow, unable to fly, sitting in his palms with its eyes wide and frightened. "It fell out of the nest up in the barn eaves," he said. "Can we help it?" Eleanor looked at the bird. She looked at Samuel, at his careful hands, at the serious expression on his face, at the way he was already trying to figure out how to do the right thing. Something loosened in her chest. "Yes," she said, "we can try. Come here. Let's figure out what it needs." They spent the next hour researching the problem with the same seriousness Samuel would have given any important undertaking, with Eleanor talking through what she knew about injured birds and Samuel, listening with intense attention and asking questions that were more perceptive than most adults would have managed. They made a small nest from a basket and a piece of flannel. They found a way to keep it warm. They agreed on a feeding schedule. It was, Eleanor thought later, the first time she and Samuel had worked on something together, as equals him bringing his knowledge of the barn and the land, her bringing her knowledge of biology and care, and when they finally had the birds settled, and Samuel sat back on his heels and looked at their work with satisfaction, he looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. "You're good at figuring things out," he said. It sounded from Samuel like the highest possible compliment. "So are you," she said. He thought about that. He seemed to decide it was acceptable. He looked back at the bird. "What if it doesn't make it?" he said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She knew he was not just asking about the bird. "Then we'll know we did everything we could," she said. "And that matters, even when the outcome is hard." Samuel nodded slowly. "That's what Papa says about things on the ranch," he said. "That you can't control the outcome. You can only control the work." "Your papa is right," Eleanor said. Samuel was quiet for another moment. Then, without looking at her, in the quick sideways way of children who are saying something important and protecting themselves from the response at the same time, he said, "I'm glad you're here." 3 words, said to the flannel-wrapped basket on the kitchen floor. But Eleanor heard them the way they were meant to be heard. She kept her voice even. She kept her face calm. She looked at the bird in the basket, and she said, "I'm glad I'm here too, Samuel." And that was the whole of it. No ceremony, no wait. Just the truth, laid down simply between them the way stones are laid to make a path. She remembered Rosalie's letter in her pocket. She thought about what Rosalie had written about Eleanor building her life on another person's desperation. She thought about Samuel's hands around that bird. She thought about Grant saying thank you in the doorway with the extra weight in his voice. She thought about Hat saying she's right to the creek bank. She thought about Mrs. Holt on the train. "Montana will need everything you have. And probably a few things you don't know you have yet." She was learning what those things were. She put her hand in her apron pocket. She took out Rosalie's letter. She got up, walked to the stove, opened the grate, and dropped it in. She watched it catch. She closed the grate. She went back to the table. She had work to do. 2 days later, Grant brought a lawyer from Helena to the ranch, a methodical man named Collins, who wore spectacles and carried a leather document case, and who looked at Eleanor's organized summary with the slightly surprised expression of a man finding something. He expected to have to search for already laid out and waiting for him. "This is thorough," he told Grant. "It's hers," Grant said. Collins looked at Eleanor. "You compiled this," he said. "Yes," she said. "Where did you study?" "I didn't," she said. "I read." Collins pushed his spectacles up his nose and looked at the summary again. "There are men in Helena who've been practicing law for 20 years who don't organize evidence this clearly." Eleanor said nothing. Collins looked at Grant. "She's right about the filing strategy. If we move in the next 10 days, Voss has nothing solid to build on. I can have the documentation registered with the count by end of next week." "Do it," Grant said. When Collins left, Grant walked with him to the horses, and Eleanor stayed on the porch, and she heard Collins say to Grant not quietly enough, "Where did you find her?" Grant's answer was short and level and carried no apology in it. "She found us," he said. Eleanor looked at the Montana sky. She let herself feel for one careful moment what it felt like to be found. Then she went inside and got back to work, because that was who she was, and for the first time in her life, who she was felt like more than enough. But Harlan Voss was not finished. 3 days after Collins filed the documentation, a man appeared at the ranch gate, not Voss himself, but a man who worked for him, a lean, quiet man named Birch who handed Grant a sealed envelope and rode away without speaking. Grant read the letter inside. He did not tell Eleanor what it said that evening. But she saw his face when he came in from the yard, and she saw the way he sat at the dinner table with his hands too still and his jaw set in the particular way that meant he was deciding how much to carry alone. She waited until Samuel had gone to bed. She set 2 cups of coffee on the table. She sat down across from him. "Tell me," she said. He looked at her. He put his hands around the coffee cup. He said, "Voss knows about the legal filing. He's threatening to contest it through a judge he has influence with in the capital. He says if I pursue this, he'll make it long and expensive and damaging." Eleanor was very still. "He's bluffing about the judge," she said. "Or at least he's exaggerating his influence. If he had a judge in his pocket cleanly, he wouldn't be threatening. He'd be acting." Grant looked at her. "You think it's a pressure tactic," he said. "I think it's a man who is used to people backing down," she said. "I think he expected you to consider your options and decide it wasn't worth the fight." She met his gaze. Was he right? Silence, long silence. Grant looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the table. He looked up at her. "No," he said. He wasn't right. Eleanor felt something steady and solid move through her. "Then we don't back down," she said. "We give Collins everything he needs, and we stand our ground. And we make it clear that we are not the kind of people who can be pressured into surrender." Grant watched her for a long moment. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes, why are you fighting this like it's yours?" The question landed differently than he probably meant it to. She felt it in her sternum. She looked at him, really looked at him. At the serious face and the careful eyes, and the man who had written her a letter that said, "I believe you are exactly who I have been looking for." And she said the truest thing she had said out loud since she arrived in Montana. "Because it is mine," she said. "This is my home. Samuel is he's mine to protect." "And you—" She stopped. She stopped because what she had been about to say was true, and she was not yet ready to examine how true it was. She looked at the table. "I'm not going to stand aside while someone tries to take what belongs to this family," she said. "I'm not built that way." The kitchen was very quiet. Grant did not say anything for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "No. You're not." He said it like something he had observed and confirmed, and was now filing away permanently, the way a man files something he intends to keep. They sat across from each other in the lamplight for a moment, more 2 people who had begun this arrangement as strangers, and were becoming, quietly and without ceremony, and entirely against what either of them had expected, something else entirely. Then Eleanor picked up her coffee cup. "I'll write to Collins in the morning," she said. Good, he said. They drank their coffee. And outside the ranch house, the Montana night was wide and dark and full of stars, and Harlan Voss was still planning, still moving, still believing that a widowed rancher and his mail-order bride from Missouri were not something he needed to take seriously. He did not yet understand what Eleanor Whitmore had understood about herself for a very long time. That the most dangerous thing in the world is a person who has been underestimated long enough to stop being angry about it and start being strategic. She was done being underestimated. She was just getting started. Collins sent word on a Friday morning, and the word was not good. The letter arrived with the morning post, and Grant read it, standing in the front hallway still in his work coat, and Eleanor watched his face go through 3 separate expressions in the space of about 4 seconds first reading. Then understanding, then the particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow and deciding not to show it. He handed her the letter without saying anything. She read it. Collins had filed the documentation as planned. The county registrar had accepted it. But in the 3 days between Collins' filing and the registrar processing the paperwork, someone had beaten them to it. A secondary water usage claim, filed under a subsidiary name Eleanor did not recognize, not Voss Land Holdings, a different name, a smaller company. Something that would take time to trace back to its source had been entered into the county record 48 hours before Collins's filing. 48 hours, 2 days, he knew, Eleanor said. He knew, Grant confirmed. He knew before Birch delivered that letter. She looked up from the page. That letter wasn't a threat, it was a distraction. He sent it so you'd spend 2 days thinking about whether to fight, and while you were thinking, his people were at the county office. Grant's jaw was tight. Collins says the subsidiary claim is thin. Poorly documented. But it's on the record now, and contesting it will take months. Possibly longer if Voss uses his political connections to slow the process. What does Collins recommend? He recommends we prepare for a long legal fight and hope Voss's connections in the capital aren't as solid as he claims. Eleanor set the letter down on the hall table. She stood very still for a moment, thinking, not panicking, not calculating desperate moves, just thinking with the clear, flat focus that had always been her particular strength, and that the world had always been too busy dismissing her to notice. He made a mistake, she said. Grant looked at her. Filing under a subsidiary, she said. If he'd filed under Voss Land Holdings directly, it would be clean. Hard to attack. But a subsidiary, a company we don't immediately recognize, that means there's a paper trail. A chain of ownership. And if the chain isn't documented perfectly, if there's any gap between that company and Voss personally, then the claim isn't just thin. It might be fraudulent. Grant was very still. Can you find the chain, he said. Give me the name of the company on that filing, and 3 days, she said. He gave her the name that same morning. She started that afternoon. What followed was 3 days that Eleanor would remember for the rest of her life, not for any dramatic reason, but because they were the days she finally understood what she was capable of. She sat at the desk in the study with every document they had, every county record Collins could send by courier. Every scrap of information she could trace from the company name through the territory's business registration records, and she built a map. Not on paper in her head, the way she had always organized information, in the clear architectural space behind her eyes where structure lived. The company was called Western Territorial Holdings. Western Territorial Holdings had been incorporated 8 months ago, right around the time the survey markers had appeared on the south parcel. Its registered agent was a man named Doyle, a Helena attorney who appeared in several other filings connected to Voss Land Holdings. The chain of connection was not explicit. It was constructed of proximity and timing and, in the language of someone who understood how to build a legal distance between himself and something he did not want his name directly on. But Eleanor had grown up in a household where she was expected to be invisible, which meant she had spent 25 years learning to read the spaces between things. She knew how to find the truth in what people did not say. She knew how to follow the negative space. On the second day, she found it. Western Territorial Holdings had filed 3 previous claims in 2 other counties over the past 18 months, all under Doyle's name as registered agent. 2 of those claims had been successfully contested by other landowners. In one case, the contesting landowner had produced correspondence that showed direct communication between Doyle and Voss, using the Voss Land Holdings letterhead. A different county, a different case, a paper trail that nobody had thought to connect to this one. Because nobody had been looking across county lines. Eleanor sat back in her chair, her heart was beating very fast. She picked up her pen and began writing. She wrote through the night. When Grant came to the study door at 6 in the morning, he had checked twice in the night and found the lamp still burning, and let her be. Which was one of the things about him she was beginning to understand was specifically. Particularly him. She was still at the desk, but she had stopped writing. She was sitting with her hands folded on top of a stack of papers, and she was looking at the wall with the expression of someone who has just finished something difficult and is allowing themselves one moment before the next thing begins. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. "I found it," she said. She watched him cross to the desk. She watched him pick up the papers and read. She watched his expression change slowly, in the way of a man who is reading carefully and not permitting himself to react until he is certain, and then settle into something she had not seen on Grant Callahan's face before. Something that looked unmistakably like relief. "This is enough," he said. "It's enough to take to Collins," she said. "It's enough to challenge the legitimacy of the subsidiary claim and to open an investigation into whether Voss's connection to that company constitutes fraud against the county record." She paused. "It won't be fast, but it changes the legal position entirely. We're not defending anymore, we're pursuing." Grant set the papers down. He looked at her for a moment, looked at her with the kind of attention he gave to things that mattered, the full, unguarded attention of a man who was not performing anything. "You've been up all night," he said. "Yes. Did you eat anything?" The question surprised a small laugh out of her. "No." He went to the kitchen and came back with bread and cold meat and coffee, and he set it on the corner of the desk without ceremony, and then he pulled the chair from beside the bookcase and sat down across from her. And they went through the papers together, Grant reading and asking questions, Eleanor answering with the precision of someone who had built the argument from the ground up and knew every brick of it. Tom Barker appeared in the doorway at 7:30, hat in hand, and looked between them. "You two been in here all night?" he said. "She has," Grant said. Tom looked at Eleanor with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something open, something that had let go of its previous position. "Collins needs to see that," Tom said, nodding at the stack of papers. "He'll have it by end of today," Grant said. Tom put his hat back on. He looked at Eleanor one more time. Then he said simply "good," and walked back toward the barn. It was, Eleanor understood, the closest Tom Barker was likely to come to an apology for 3 weeks of careful skepticism. She accepted it. Collins received the papers by courier that afternoon. His response came back within 36 hours, and for the first time since Voss had ridden into the yard with his smooth voice and his coat that was too fine for a Thursday visit, the word from Collins was unambiguously good. The cross-county connection was solid. The fraud argument was viable. And more importantly, Collins had a contact at the territorial capital who had confirmed that Voss's influence with the relevant judge was considerably less solid than Voss had implied. The judge in question had, in fact, recently come under scrutiny for exactly the kind of favoritism Voss depended on, and was currently being extremely careful about anything that could be construed as misconduct. He overplayed his hand, Grant said, reading Collins's letter at the dinner table. "Powerful men often do," Eleanor said. "They get used to winning and they stop calculating the risk." Across the table, Samuel looked between his father and Eleanor with the sharp attention of a child who understands that something important is happening even when he doesn't understand all the details. "Are we going to win?" he asked. Grant looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Samuel. "We're going to fight correctly," she said. "Which is the best way to make sure we do." Samuel thought about that. "Is that different from winning?" "Sometimes," Eleanor said. "But right now in this case, no, it's not different." Samuel looked satisfied. He went back to his dinner. And under the table, in a gesture Eleanor almost missed, Grant's hand moved across the wood and rested, for just a moment, over hers where it lay beside her plate. Not grasping, not demanding, just present, just landing there briefly, like a word that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Then he picked up his fork and continued eating. And Eleanor looked at her plate and felt her heart doing something she had not given it permission to do, and she breathed steadily through it, the way she breathed, through everything that mattered, and she kept going. The town of Franklin, Missouri, found out about the legal battle through Vivian. How Vivian found out was something Eleanor never fully traced, but she suspected Rosalie, who had a cousin in Helena, who moved in the kind of social circles that talked about the Callahan Ranch. And news traveled between women the way water finds its level inevitably, through every available crack. A letter arrived from Vivian that was different in character from Rosalie's earlier letter. Less cruel, more carefully worded, which was somehow worse. Vivian wrote that she was concerned about Eleanor being caught up in a legal dispute that sounded dangerous and complicated, and that the family would understand him completely if Eleanor needed to come home and regroup, and that nobody in Franklin would think less of her for acknowledging that the situation had become more than she'd bargained for. Eleanor read the letter in the kitchen. Samuel was at the table doing his lessons. He looked up. "Bad news," he said. "A letter from my sister," Eleanor said. "The one who sent you here?" She looked at him. She had not told Samuel the full story of how she had come to be at Callahan Ranch. But children hear things. Children are present at conversations adults forget they are having. "Yes," she said. "What does she want?" Eleanor folded the letter. "She wants me to come home." Samuel's face changed. Fast. Something moved across it. Fear, she thought, or the shape fear takes in a child who has learned to keep it controlled. "Are you?" he said. "No," she said. She said it without hesitation. Without weight, just the clean, flat fact of it. Samuel looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back down at his lesson book. "Good," he said, in the same tight voice he used when he was pretending not to feel things he was feeling very deeply. She put Vivian's letter in the stove the same way she had put Rosalie's letter in the stove, and she washed her hands and sat down beside Samuel and looked at his lesson, and she said, "You're setting up this equation wrong. Start from the left." He looked at the page. "Oh," he said. Yeah, they worked through the lesson together, and neither of them said another word about Franklin. What happened next came from a direction Eleanor had not been watching, which was the lesson she would later take most seriously from everything that occurred in that fall at Callahan Ranch, that the threat you track is rarely the threat that actually arrives. She had been focused on the legal documents. She had been focused on Collins and the filings and the cross-county paper trail, and the question of Voss's influence at the Capitol. She had been so focused on the large, visible battle that she had not been paying enough attention to the smaller, quieter movements happening closer to the ground. Hat was the one who came to find her. She was in the kitchen garden in the late afternoon, salvaging the last of the fall vegetables before the temperature dropped, when she heard his boots on the path and looked up to find him moving with a purpose that was different from his usual unhurried gait. "Something's happened," he said. She straightened up. "The north fence line," he said, 3 sections cut. "And the cattle in the north pasture, 12 of them, are gone." Eleanor went cold, not frightened, cold, the particular cold of a mind moving very fast through implications. "When?" she said. "Must have been last night. Tom found it an hour ago." "Has anyone told Grant? He's out on the East Range." "Tom's riding to get him now." Eleanor pulled off her garden gloves. She said, "Birch." Hat looked at her. "The man Voss sent with the letter," she said. "The quiet one. He would know the ranch layout. He would know where the north fence line is most accessible." Hat's face did something complicated. "We didn't see anyone." "You weren't looking for fence cutting," she said. "You were looking for a direct approach. Riders coming in through the gate. Something visible." She was already walking toward the barn. "This is not Voss making a legal move. This is Voss reminding Grant that legal moves aren't the only kind he knows how to make." Hat fell into step beside her. "You think he'll escalate," he said. "I think he already has," she said. Grant arrived back at the ranch at a pace that raised dust, and Eleanor was waiting in the yard when he rode in, and he looked at her face and swung down from the horse before it had fully stopped. "Tell me," he said. She told him everything what Hat had reported, her reading of the situation, her certainty that this was Voss, and her belief that it was a deliberate pressure tactic designed to do what the legal threat had failed to do: make Grant feel that the fight was costing him more than it was worth. Grant listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at Tom, who was standing to one side. "The cattle. Can we track them already on it?" Tom said. "Denny and Pete are following the trail north. They'll find where they were taken." "If Voss's people took them, they won't have gone far," Eleanor said. "It's not about the cattle. It's about making you feel exposed. They'll want the cattle found. They want you to know they can reach inside your operation." Grant's face was stone still. "He wants me to come to him," he said. "Yes, and if don't," Eleanor said flat. "Direct, immediate. If you go to him now angry and reactive, he wins the conversation before it starts. He wants you off balance. He wants you making decisions from anger instead of strategy." She held his gaze. "Let Collins handle the legal track. Let Tom and the men handle the cattle. And you stay on your ranch, on your ground, and you do not give Harlan Voss the satisfaction of seeing you rattled." The yard was very quiet. Hat had his arms crossed and his hat brim pulled down, but his eyes were on Eleanor. Tom was watching Grant. Grant was watching Eleanor. "You're asking me to stand still while he moves against me," he said. Not argumentative, testing the idea. "I'm asking you to be smarter than he expects you to be," she said. "He expects a rancher's response. He has already planned for it." "He has not planned for this." She gestured between the two of them, the document work, the legal track, the patience. "He does not know who he is actually dealing with here." Something shifted in Grant's face. Something that was not quite a smile. Grant Callahan did not smile easily or frequently, but was the shape of one, the acknowledgement behind the eyes. "No," he said quietly, "he doesn't." The cattle came back 2 days later. Denny and Pete found them in a makeshift holding pen on unfenced territory 10 miles north of the ranch, poorly guarded, essentially waiting to be found. Eleanor had been right. The whole exercise was theatrical. It was a show of reach, not a genuine theft. Grant said nothing publicly about it. He had the cattle brought back, the fence repaired, and he sent word to Collins with a description of the incident and a request to add it to the record of Voss's conduct. Documentation. Everything became documentation. Voss sent no further message. The silence was louder than anything he had said. It was the silence of a man recalculating. The first hard frost came in October, and with it came the first real test of what the ranch could handle in winter. And Eleanor discovered that handling a frontier ranch through the change of season was a different kind of challenge entirely from the legal and strategic battles she had been fighting. This was physical, relentless, cold that came in under doors regardless of what you stuffed against the gap, livestock that needed extra management as temperatures dropped, a kitchen garden that had to be fully put to bed before the ground froze. A household that required a complete reconfiguring of its rhythms to manage the season. She threw herself into it without complaint. She was up before 4 some mornings. She learned things she had never imagined. She would need to know how to manage the stove properly in extreme cold, so it heated the house without risk, how to preserve the remaining vegetables, how to organize the winter supplies, how to recognize the signs of weather changing in ways that required moving the cattle. She made mistakes. She corrected them. She asked when she did not know, and she figured out what she could not ask, and she kept going. The ranch hands stopped watching her, not because they lost interest. Because the assessment was complete. The verdict had come in. She belonged here, and they knew it, and after that it was simply a matter of working together in the way of people who have accepted each other. Denny, who was the youngest of the hands, and had been the most skeptical of her when she arrived, was the one who taught her how to wrap the pipes on the east side of the house that were most vulnerable to freezing. He did it without any ceremony whatsoever, standing beside her in the cold, explaining the process with the same matter-of-fact competence he brought to everything, and when she got it right the first time he said, "There you go. with a nod that was the exact equivalent of a lengthy speech about respect. She nodded back, that was that. What she did not expect was Samuel. She had been aware of the slow, careful progress with Samuel, the shared lesson hours. The small bird they had nursed through 4 weeks before it was strong enough to fly, and Samuel had released it with shaking hands, and a very controlled expression that she understood meant he was managing feelings he did not yet have words for. She had been aware of the way he had moved from watchful to present, from present to occasional warmth, from occasional warmth to something that looked more and more like simple comfort. What she had not been prepared for was the nightmare. She woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of him crying out, not a childish sound, not the sound of a bad dream about ordinary things. A deeper sound, a sound that came from somewhere pain had settled and gone quiet, and then in sleep broken open again. She was out of bed before she was fully awake. She went to his room. She pushed open the door. He was sitting up in bed, both hands clutching the blanket, still half in the dream, and when she came to the side of the bed and said his name quietly, he looked at her with eyes that were present and terrified and very young. "Hey," she said. "Hey, I'm here. You're at the ranch. You're safe." He looked around the room. He looked back at her. "I dreamed she was calling me," he said. His voice was raw. "My mama, and I couldn't find her." Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed. She did not say anything right away. She did not reach for him either, because Samuel had to decide when he was ready to be reached for, and she knew this by now with the certainty of someone who has paid very close attention. "That sounds like a very hard dream," she said. She kept calling, his voice cracked on the last word. He pressed his lips together hard, the way his father pressed his lips together when something was more than he wanted to show. "Sometimes," Eleanor said, carefully, "the people we love stay in our dreams because part of us is still talking to them. Still working through the things we never got to say." She paused. "That's not a bad thing, Samuel, even when it hurts." He was quiet. "Do you think she can hear me?" he said. "When I dream." It was the most serious question anyone had asked Eleanor in a long time, and she treated it with exactly the seriousness it deserved. "I think love doesn't stop," she said. "I think it changes shape. But I don't think it stops." She looked at him steadily. "And I think your mama knew how much you loved her." "I think she knew that completely." Something broke in his face. Not collapsed, broke open, the way ground breaks open in spring, necessary, productive, the prerequisite for anything that grows. He did not cry loudly. He cried the way children cry when they have been trying very hard not to, in shuddering quiet breaths, with his face turned slightly away from her in the instinctive, heartbreaking way of a small person protecting his dignity. She put her hand on his back. He didn't move away. She sat there with him, not talking, not fixing anything, just there. Her hand on his back while the grief moved through him the way it needed to. And after a while his breathing steadied, and he lay back down, and she adjusted the blanket over him, and she sat there a while longer in the dark. "Miss Eleanor," he said, almost asleep. "I'm here," she said. "Don't go," he said. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. She stayed until she was certain he was asleep. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the small shape of him under the blanket, and she felt something so large and quiet moving through her that she had no name for it. Only the knowledge that it was important, and that it was permanent, and that nothing would ever be quite the same as it had been before this moment. She turned to leave. Grant was in the hallway. He had been there. She did not know how long. His face was in shadow, but she could see his eyes, and what was in them was something she had no precedent for: an openness, a rawness, the expression of a man watching something happen that he had believed, for a long time, could not happen again. They stood in the hallway outside his son's room, 3 feet apart, and neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say. Everything had already been said in the room behind her, and he had heard it, and they both knew it. He stepped back slightly, making room for her to pass. As she passed him, his hand moved briefly, lightly, to her arm. Not stopping her, just contact, just the acknowledgement of what had just happened, carried in the simplest possible gesture, because some things are too large for language. She went back to her room. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling in the dark, and she thought about what love actually was, not the version in the romantic novels her sisters read, not the version Franklin had taught her to expect and then withheld, but the real thing, the actual thing. The thing built from showing up and staying and doing the next necessary thing without needing anyone to notice. She thought about Grant's hand on her arm in the hallway. She thought about Samuel saying don't go. She thought about Eleanor Whitmore, plain daughter of the Whitmore family of Franklin, Missouri, lying in the dark in a ranch house in Montana Territory, with frost on the windows and a sleeping child down the hall, and a man in the next room who had just looked at her like she was something he could not afford to lose. She had come out here as a joke. She had come out here because her sisters wanted to humiliate her, and a stranger had surprised everyone by writing back. She had come out here with nothing but a trunk and 3 books and a stubborn, careful, lifelong conviction that she was worth more than anyone had bothered to see. And she lay in the dark on a cold October night in the Montana Territory, and she thought, this is what I came for, not the ranch, not the legal victory they were building. Not even Samuel, though Samuel had become as necessary to her as breathing. The feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The feeling of a life that fit her, really fit her, the way a good tool fits the hand of someone who knows how to use it. She had not built this from anything anyone had given her. She had built it from what she was, and what she had always been, and what the world had spent 25 years failing to notice. Outside, the Montana wind moved across the plains with the cold authority of something that has been here longer than any of them, and will be here long after, and the frost deepened on the windows. And the ranch was quiet and solid and entirely, completely, irrevocably hers. She closed her eyes. She slept without dreaming, and in the morning Harlan Voss made his final move. The one none of them had seen coming. The one that would force Eleanor to stand up in front of the entire territory and prove not to Voss, not to Grant, not to the ranch hands or the neighbors or the people of Franklin who had spent her whole life writing her off, but to herself, once and for all, exactly who she was and what she was capable of. Voss's final move came not as a letter, not as a rider at the gate, not as a legal filing at the county office. It came as a public meeting. Collins sent word on a Tuesday a Territorial Land Commission hearing had been scheduled in Helena for the following Friday, convened under the authority of the Territorial Governor's Office to review disputed water rights claims in the region. The hearing had been called ostensibly by a coalition of local landowners concerned about water access and fair usage allocation across the territory. The language was neutral, the framing was civic, but Collins's letter made clear what the neutral language was designed to obscure. Voss had organized it, not openly. Voss's name appeared nowhere in the official notice. But 3 of the 5 landowners listed as petitioners for the hearing were men whose operations had business relationships with Voss Land Holdings that Eleanor had already documented in her cross-county research. The timing, 6 weeks after Collins filed their counter-documentation, 2 weeks after the cattle incident, was not coincidental. And the commission chair assigned to the hearing was a man named Aldrich, a territorial appointee whose previous rulings in land disputes, Collins noted with carefully professional understatement, had shown a consistent tendency to favor larger, more established commercial interests over individual ranch claims. "He's taking it out of the county courts," Grant said. He was standing at the kitchen table, Collins's letter in his hand, and his voice was flat in the way it got when he was managing something large by compressing it. "He's taking it to a commission where the rules are different," Eleanor said. She was already thinking. County courts have established procedures. Evidence standards. A commission hearing has more discretion. More room for interpretation, room for Aldrich to rule however Voss needs him to rule. Yes, Grant set the letter down. "Can Collins fight it at this level?" he said. "Collins can represent us," Eleanor said. "But a commission hearing is different from a court proceeding. It's part legal argument, part public record, part performance." She paused. "Voss knows ranchers. He knows Grant Callahan's reputation in this territory. He knows that a legal fight in a county court where the evidence is what matters is a fight he might lose. But a commission hearing, where the commissioner has discretion and the outcome can be framed as a policy decision rather than a ruling on evidence, that's a different kind of fight. What kind? She looked at him directly, the kind where who speaks matters as much as what they can prove. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Grant looked at her. You think we need to be there? I think you need to be there, she said. And I think I need to be there. And I think Collins needs every piece of documentation we've assembled, organized in the order that tells the clearest story to a room full of people who may be deciding based on as much emotion as evidence. It's 4 days, Grant said. I need to arrange coverage for the ranch. Tom can manage it, Eleanor said immediately. Hat will stay. Denny and Pete are capable. The winter preparations are as complete as they can be right now. She paused. Samuel comes with us, Grant said. She looked at him. He said it again quietly with certainty. He comes with us. I'm not leaving him here without either of us, and I'm not sending him somewhere else. He comes. Eleanor thought about Samuel in the hallway 2 weeks ago, the nightmare, the small shape under the blanket. She thought about what it would mean to Samuel to be included, to be treated as someone whose presence mattered, rather than someone to be managed and set aside. All right, she said. Grant nodded once. I'll write to Collins tonight. She was already sitting down to begin organizing the documents. The journey to Helena took most of Thursday, in the wagon with their traveling bags and Samuel between them on the bench seat. And Samuel spent the first hour quiet in the particular way that meant he was thinking hard about something he had not yet decided how to ask. He asked it about 2 hours in. Papa, he said, is the ranch in trouble? Grant glanced at him, then at Eleanor, then back at the road. There's a man who wants to take something that belongs to us, he said. We're going to Helena to tell the people who make decisions why he's wrong. Samuel thought about that. What if they don't believe you? Then we tell them again, Eleanor said more clearly. Samuel considered this. What if he has more money than us, Mrs. Patterson in town says that rich men always win these things. Mrs. Patterson, Grant said, in a tone that communicated a complete sentence without completing it. Mrs. Patterson is not always wrong, Eleanor said carefully, but she's not always right either. Money gives some advantages, but documentation gives different ones. She looked at Samuel. Do you know what documentation means? Evidence, Samuel said. Proof, yes, and the proof in this case is solid, she paused. We didn't come this far by being careless. Samuel looked ahead at the road. Okay, he said. He leaned slightly into Eleanor's side. Not deliberately. The way people do when they have decided without making a decision that somewhere is safe. She did not move away. She let him lean. They arrived in Helena Thursday evening and stayed at a boarding house Collins had arranged, and Collins came that evening to go over the structure of the hearing with Grant. Eleanor sat at the table beside Grant with the organized documentation, and she listened to Collins explain the commission's procedures, and she asked 3 questions precise. Targeted questions that made Collins pause each time and look at her with the recalibrated expression she was getting used to, from professional men who had expected to explain things to her, and found instead that she was ahead of them. After the 3rd question, Collins set down his pen and said, Mrs. Callahan. Eleanor, she said. Eleanor. He paused. Have you considered that you might be more useful to this case inside the hearing room than in the audience? Grant looked at Collins. What does that mean? It means, Collins said, that the commission allows interested parties to speak on record during the public testimony portion of the hearing. It's not a legal proceeding. Witnesses aren't sworn, but statements made on record carry weight, particularly if they're specific and documented. He looked at Eleanor. The counter-documentation you assembled, the cross-county connection between Voss and Western Territorial Holdings. The pattern of filings, I can present these as evidence. But if someone who built that case presents them directly, explains the logic, walks this commission through the reasoning, it lands differently than a lawyer reading from a brief. The table was quiet. Eleanor looked at the stack of documents in front of her. She thought about Franklin, Missouri, about every room she had sat in where her presence was an afterthought, about every conversation she had held the edges of while the people at the center looked past her, about Mrs. Garrett on the station platform saying, "Are you certain about this, dear?" in that tone of gentle condescension. She thought about standing in front of a room full of strangers and speaking. She thought about Voss in the yard with his fine coat and his smooth voice and his 48-hour head start on a filing he had planned for months. She looked up. "All right," she said. Grant looked at her. "Are you sure?" he said, and she knew him well enough by now to know that he was not asking because he doubted her. He was asking because he wanted her to have chosen it clearly, without pressure, for herself. "Yes," she said. "Then we'll add her to the speakers list," Collins said, and opened his notebook and wrote it down, and that was that. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the narrow bed in the boarding house room, and she went through what she intended to say, not memorizing it. She did not work that way, but walking through the logic of it, the sequence. The moments where she would need to be precise, and the moments where precision alone would not be enough, and she would need to be something harder to define. Convincing, present, the kind of person a room believes. She had never been the kind of person a room believed. She had been the kind of person a room forgot was there. She turned onto her side. She thought about Grant saying she found us on the station platform to Collins. She thought about Hat saying she was right to the creek bank. She thought about Samuel saying don't go. She thought about the Montana sky and the ranch and the kitchen at 4 in the morning with the lamp burning and the accounts spread out and the specific unglamorous, deeply satisfying feeling of work that mattered being done by the person best suited to do it. She was that person. She had always been that person. She closed her eyes. She slept. The commission hearing was held in the Territorial Government Building in Helena, in a large room with wooden benches and a raised platform where Commissioner Aldrich sat flanked by 2 associates. The room was full. Eleanor had not expected it to be so full. Ranchers from the surrounding region, business interests from Helena, attorneys and their clients, and people who appeared to be there simply because territorial land disputes were the closest thing to public theater that Helena offered on a Friday morning. Voss was already seated when they arrived at a table on the left side of the room, flanked by 2 attorneys Eleanor did not recognize. He looked up when they entered. His gaze moved from Grant to Collins to Eleanor, and in the fraction of a second before he arranged his face back into its professional pleasantness, she saw it a flicker of genuine surprise. He had not expected her to be here. He had expected Grant Callahan, a grieving widower running a cattle operation, perhaps with a lawyer and some documents. He had not recalculated for the woman who had assembled those documents. He had not planned for her to be in this room. She filed that away. She sat beside Grant, and she kept her hands still in her lap, and she watched Aldrich open the hearing with the practiced neutrality of a man who has delivered official proceedings enough times that they come out sounding like weather reports. And she listened to the petitioners, Voss's proxies, present their case for the water usage claim. It was well constructed. She gave it that Voss's attorneys were good. They framed the Western Territorial Holdings claim as a legitimate commercial interest in equitable water access, used language about regional development and territorial progress that sounded civic and reasonable, and managed to make the Callahan Ranch's exclusive water rights sound like an unreasonable hoarding of a shared resource by a single private landowner. They did not mention Voss by name in connection with Western Territorial Holdings. They did not need to, as far as the official record showed. That connection did not yet exist. As far as the official record showed, Eleanor uncapped her pen. She made 3 notes on the pad Collins had put in front of her. Collins presented their counter case methodically: the water rights documentation, the historical usage records, the filing timeline that demonstrated the Western Territorial Holdings claim had been entered strategically and in bad faith. He was thorough and professional and correct, and she watched Aldrich's face while Collins spoke, and she saw what she had been afraid she might see. Polite attention, not persuasion. not the shift in a person's posture that indicates they are genuinely receiving new information. Aldrich was listening the way a man listens when he has already decided and is waiting for the speaking to be finished. She pressed her pen against the pad. Collins finished. Aldrich looked at his notes. "Are there other parties wishing to address the commission?" he said. Collins said, "Yes, Commissioner. Eleanor Callahan, who compiled the documentation in this case, would like to speak on record." Aldrich looked up. His eyes moved to Eleanor. She stood. She picked up her notes 3 lines on a pad, and she walked to the front of the room and she turned to face it. And for one single moment she felt the full weight of every version of herself she had ever been, the plain one, the overlooked one. The woman nobody in Franklin thought to watch, and she let that weight move through her and settle and become, as it always eventually did when she stopped fighting it, something solid to stand on. She looked at Aldrich. "Commissioner," she said, "my name is Eleanor Callahan. I am the wife of Grant Callahan, and I manage the financial and administrative operations of Callahan Ranch. I also assembled the documentation you have before you." She paused. "I'd like to speak to one specific aspect of that documentation that I believe has not been presented with sufficient clarity." Aldrich's expression was careful. "Proceed." "Western Territorial Holdings filed its water usage claim on the Callahan Creek 48 hours before our attorneys filed the counter-documentation," she said. "The petitioners have framed this as a legitimate commercial interest. I want to show you why that framing is incorrect." She did not look at her notes. She looked at Aldrich. 18 months ago, she said, Western Territorial Holdings filed a water access claim in Jefferson County on a different parcel. That claim was contested and ultimately dismissed. During the dismissal proceedings, the contesting party produced correspondence on Voss Land Holdings letterhead, directing the Western Territorial Holdings filings. She paused. "I have copies of that correspondence. It was filed in Jefferson County as part of the public record of those proceedings. It is accessible to anyone who looks for it." The room was very still. She heard, behind her, the sound of Voss's lead attorney leaning toward Voss and saying something in a low, urgent voice. She continued, "That correspondence demonstrates a direct documented relationship between Harland Voss, personally, and Western Territorial Holdings," she said. "It means that when Western Territorial Holdings filed against the Callahan water rights, it was not an independent commercial interest seeking equitable access. It was Harland Voss, using a corporate structure to obscure his involvement, pursuing a property interest that he had already directly attempted to purchase and been refused." She reached the 3rd line of her notes. "Commissioner, I am not a lawyer," she said. "I am a ranch manager who reads carefully and follows paper trails. And the trail I followed led from a filing that looked routine to a pattern of conduct that crosses county lines and involves deliberate misrepresentation of the filing party's identity and interest." She looked at Aldrich steadily. "I would respectfully ask this commission to request, as part of your review, the Jefferson County proceedings I have referenced. I believe what you find there will change how this case looks." She stopped. She waited. Aldrich looked at her. He looked at the documentation in front of him. He looked at his associates. He looked at Voss's table. Voss's lead attorney was already on his feet. "Commissioner, the witness is presenting unverified third-party documents from a separate jurisdiction as though they are." "They are public record," Eleanor said, still looking at Aldrich. Still calm, filed and accessible. "I am not asking you to take my word for them. I am asking you to look for yourself. The commission will take a recess," Aldrich said. He did not look at Voss's table when he said it. He looked at Eleanor. And in that look, guarded, careful, the expression of a man who has just been given a problem he did not expect and cannot afford to ignore in public, she saw that it had worked. Not won, not yet, but worked. She walked back to her seat. Grant's hand came down on hers on the table, and she felt the warmth of it, solid and immediate and entirely intentional, and she turned her hand palm up and held on, and they sat there together while the room moved and shifted around them. And she kept her face composed and her breathing even and her grip steady, and she did not let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened until later. Much later. The recess lasted 45 minutes. Eleanor drank water and spoke quietly with Collins and did not look at Voss's table and Samuel, who had been sitting in the public benches with the careful stillness of a child, who understands that this is important and is trying very hard to be worthy of being included, appeared at her elbow and said, "How did it go?" She looked at him. "We'll know in 45 minutes, she said. "But how do you think it went?" She considered him, the serious face, the old eyes, the child who deserved honesty. "I think we did everything right," she said, "and I think that matters." He nodded slowly. Then he went back to his bench and sat with his hands folded in his lap, and he looked more like his father in that moment than she had ever seen him look. The commission reconvened. Aldrich did not rule from the bench. Commissions did not work that way, he explained, in the neutral voice, that the proceedings would be reviewed, and a decision issued within 30 days. And the commission was requesting access to the Jefferson County records, referenced in the testimony for inclusion in their review, and that all parties should expect written notification of the outcome. Voss's lead attorney objected to the Jefferson County request. Aldrich overruled him with a brevity that said everything. The hearing was closed. The room began to move and shift as people gathered themselves and their things, and Eleanor was aware of noise and movement, and Grant beside her and Collins gathering papers. But what she was most aware of was the sensation inside her own chest, not triumph, not relief, something more complicated than either. Something that felt like the settling of a long, long argument with herself. She had done it, not because she had learned how to be someone else. Exactly because she had never learned to be anyone other than who she was. She was aware of Voss before she saw him. She felt the change in the air the way you feel weather before it arrives, and she looked up and found him standing 6 feet away, his attorneys flanking him, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not anger, not contempt, something more honest than either. Something that in another man might have been respect, but in Voss came out as a kind of careful assessing, regard, the look of a man reclassifying a threat. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. Grant moved to stand beside her. She felt him there without looking. "Mr. Voss," she said. Voss was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're more than I expected." She held his gaze. "Most people are," she said. Something moved in his eyes, the closest thing to acknowledgement she supposed he was capable of. He looked at Grant. "Callahan," he said by way of something. Not concession, not apology, just the acknowledgement of two men who have been in a fight and one of them has just seen how it ends. He turned and walked out. Grant watched him go. Then he looked at Eleanor, and she looked at him, and they were standing in the middle of a clearing room in Helena, Montana. And the legal battle was not finished. It would take 30 days and a written decision, and possibly more after that, but something had ended. Something had turned over. "You were extraordinary," Grant said. Not as a compliment, as a fact, the way he stated all facts directly without decoration. She felt the word land. She had been called many things in her life. Nobody had ever called her extraordinary. She looked at him for a long moment. "I was myself," she said. "I was just finally somewhere that needed who I am." He looked at her with that full, unguarded attention. The attention that she had come to understand was the most intimate thing Grant Callahan offered, more intimate than touch. The complete focus of a man who was otherwise very private, turned on her entirely and without apology. "I know," he said quietly. "Eleanor, I know that." Collins appeared at Grant's shoulder. "We should mind—" "Yes," Grant said, without looking away from Eleanor. Then he looked at Collins. "Yes, let's go." They gathered their things. They found Samuel in the entrance hall, standing very straight, trying to look like he hadn't been watching the door anxiously for 20 minutes. "Well," he said. "We won the day," Grant said. "The rest takes time." Samuel looked at Eleanor. "Did you do it? Did you say the thing?" "I said several things," Eleanor said. "Did it work?" She crouched to his level, the same instinct as the first day, the same deliberate meeting of his eyes. "It worked," she said. Samuel did something she had only seen him do twice before in all the weeks she'd been at the ranch. He smiled, not the careful, controlled expression he wore most of the time, but the real one, the open one, the one that transformed his old young face into something that was simply a child being happy. He took her hand, not ceremony, not performance, just his small hand in hers, the same way he might have taken his father's, the entirely natural gesture of a child who has decided where he belongs. She held on. They walked out of the territorial building together into the cold Helena air. The three of them, Grant and Eleanor and Samuel, with his hand in hers. And it struck her then, with the quiet force of the absolutely true, that this was what her life looked like now. That this was what she had become, out here in a territory that had no patience for what people used to be, that only cared about what they could do. She had come here as a joke, she had stayed as herself. And that simple, hard, entirely unglamorous thing had turned out to be more than enough. More than she had ever let herself hope for. More than Franklin, Missouri had ever thought to offer her. She held Samuel's hand and she walked beside Grant, and the Montana wind was cold against her face, and she thought, this is mine. Every piece of this, I built this, not alone, but that was the point. She had never needed to be alone to be strong. She had only needed somewhere that finally let her be both. The ride back to the ranch was long and cold, and Samuel fell asleep against her shoulder. Somewhere in the second hour, his weight trusting and complete, and Grant drove in his quiet way beside her, and at some point in the third hour. Without discussion, his arm moved around her shoulders, not romantic, not careful, just there, just warm, just the simple physical fact of two people who have stopped pretending they are strangers, and she leaned into it, and the horses moved. And the land stretched out ahead of them, and the ranch waited at the end of it, solid and real and entirely, permanently, irrevocably theirs. The commission's written decision arrived on a Thursday morning, 31 days after the Helena hearing. Eleanor was in the kitchen when she heard the rider come into the yard. She heard Tom's voice, then the sound of boots on the porch steps, and then Grant was in the doorway with an envelope in his hand, and his face doing the thing it did when he was holding himself very still on purpose. She set down her coffee cup. She did not say anything. He opened it. He looked up. "We won," he said. 2 words. Flat and direct, the way Grant said everything that mattered most, stripped of performance, carrying only the weight of the thing itself. Eleanor sat down, not because her legs gave out, because the decision to sit down was the only way she knew how to receive something this large without letting it knock her sideways. She sat down and she put her hands flat on the table, and she looked at them, her hands, the hands that had worked through every document, traced every filing, written every summary, organized every piece of evidence that had just protected this ranch, and she breathed. The commission ruled the Western Territorial Holdings claim fraudulent, Grant said, still reading. Aldrich is recommending a review of Voss's existing land filings in 3 counties. Collins says there may be criminal implications, not certain. But possible. The Jefferson County documents, Eleanor said. Yes, she looked up. Did Collins say anything else? Grant set the letter on the table between them and looked at her with the full, quiet attention she had come to understand was his particular form of saying things he did not know how to say out loud. He said Grant began and then stopped. His jaw moved slightly. He tried again. He said that in 30 years of practicing territorial law, he has never seen a private individual assemble a cross-jurisdictional fraud case from public documents without legal training. He paused. He said we should consider that Eleanor Callahan is a considerable asset to this territory. The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor looked at the letter on the table. She thought about Rosalie writing a letter designed to humiliate her and sending it to a stranger hundreds of miles away. She thought about the tone of it, not beautiful, not graceful, but useful, and how Rosalie had meant it as cruelty, and it had turned out to be the most accurate description anyone had ever written of her. Useful. She had never been more useful in her life. "Tell Collins thank you," she said. "I will." Grant did not move. He was still looking at her. "Eleanor." She looked up. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and he folded his hands on the table in the way he did when he was organizing himself to say something difficult, not difficult because it was bad. She had learned to read the difference. But difficult because it was true and large, and he was not a man who handled large true things easily in language. When you arrived here, he said, I told you I was not offering romance. I told you this was a practical arrangement between two people who needed something the other could provide. I remember, she said. I was wrong, he said. She went very still. Not about what I said, he continued carefully. What I said was accurate at the time. I was wrong about what I thought that meant. About what I thought the limits of it were. He looked at his hands. Looked up at her. I have been watching you for 5 months. I have watched you take something that was meant to be a joke at your expense and turn it into this. Into everything. His voice was rougher than usual. You saved this ranch. You did something for Samuel that I did not know how to do. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, he stopped. He pressed his lips together. He tried again. You made this a home, he said. Not a house, not an operation, a home. And I don't know when it happened exactly, but at some point I stopped thinking about this place as something I manage and started thinking about it as somewhere I want to be. Because you're here. Eleanor's chest was full of something that had no name. She looked at Grant Callahan, at the serious face and the careful eyes, and the man who had written her a letter that said, I believe you are exactly who I have been looking for, and had turned out to be more right about that than either of them knew. And she felt the full weight of 5 months pressing forward into this moment. Grant, she said. I'm not saying this to create an obligation, he said quickly. I know this started as an arrangement. I know you came here for your own reasons, and they were good reasons, and I have never— Grant, she said again with more force. He stopped. She looked at him. I burned my sister's letters, she said. Both of them, in the kitchen stove. The first one told me to come home. The second one told me not to mistake your practicality for something more than it was. She paused. I burned them because I already knew they were wrong. I already knew what this was. He held her gaze. What is it? He said. Quiet, direct, the most serious question he had ever asked her. Something I am not going to waste, she said. The kitchen was very quiet for a long moment. Then Grant Callahan, who was not a man who moved without intention, reached across the table and took her hand, not briefly, not lightly, not in the passing way of the hallway outside Samuel's room or the commission hearing room. He took her hand the way a man takes something he intends to keep. All right, he said. All right, she said, and that without ceremony, without performance, in a ranch house kitchen in Montana Territory on a Thursday morning, with the commission's decision letter on the table between them, was how it was settled. They told Samuel that evening, not with a formal announcement. Not with the weight of an occasion, just at the dinner table, in the ordinary rhythm of an ordinary evening, Samuel talking about the barn cats, Grant listening, Eleanor passing bread, and Grant said simply, Samuel, I want to talk to you about something. Samuel looked up with the alertness of a child who has learned that conversations that begin that way require full attention. Miss Eleanor and I have decided that what we have here is more than an arrangement, Grant said. I want you to know that. Samuel looked at Eleanor. He looked at his father. He looked at Eleanor again. Does that mean she stays? He said. It means she stays, Grant said. Samuel picked up his fork. He put it down again. He looked at his plate with the expression he wore when he was managing something he did not want to mishandle. I already knew, he said in a voice that was so carefully controlled it broke Eleanor's heart a little. You knew? Grant said. You look at her different than you look at other people, Samuel said, still looking at his plate. You looked at Mama that way, I remembered. The table was absolutely silent. Eleanor watched Grant absorb his son's words, watched him take them in the way you take in something that is both a wound and a gift simultaneously, something that hurts exactly because it is precious. Samuel, Grant said. Samuel looked up. Is that all right? Grant said. Samuel held his father's gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Eleanor, at her directly, with those old eyes that saw more than they were supposed to see. She didn't try to be Mama, Samuel said. She was just her. And she stayed. That's all I wanted.
Someone who—
Eleanor pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry at the dinner table. She had made that decision approximately 3 months ago, and she was committed to it. Then I'll keep staying, she said. Her voice was steady. Barely. Samuel nodded once, decisive the way his father nodded. He picked up his fork. The gray cat had 3 kittens, he said. I found them this morning in the hay. Grant blinked at the transition. Eleanor felt a laugh move through her, sudden and real and warm. 3 kittens, she said. We'll need to check on them tomorrow. I already checked, Samuel said. They're fine. And the dinner table carried on, and the evening carried on, and the ranch carried on in its steady rhythm, and Eleanor sat in the middle of all of it and felt the specific, irreplaceable warmth of a life that had found its shape. Word traveled the way word always travels in places where people pay attention to each other's business. It started with Collins, who told his colleague in Helena about the cross-county documentation work, and the colleague mentioned it at a territorial land management meeting. And from there it moved the way truth moves when it is interesting enough outward, in all directions, without needing anyone to push it. Within 3 weeks of the commission's decision, Eleanor Callahan was a name that people in Helena knew. Not famous, not celebrated, recognized. The kind of recognition that comes when people with actual problems start looking for people who can actually solve them. 2 ranchers from the eastern part of the territory rode out to Callahan Ranch in early November to ask Grant about the water rights process, and ended up spending 2 hours at the kitchen table with Eleanor while she walked them through the documentation strategy. They left with organized notes and the address of a county records office they had not known to check. One of them wrote a letter afterward. He addressed it to Eleanor. He thanked her, specifically, by name, for what she had explained. He said that the information had helped him identify a similar filing situation on his own property. He said he did not know that ranches had people like her. She read the letter twice. She folded it and put it in the small cedar box in her room, where she kept the things she intended to keep. Not because she needed the validation, because she wanted to remember what it felt like the first time someone in Montana wrote her name at the top of a letter and called her an expert. Grant found her reading it at the desk in the study. Good news, he said. She handed him the letter. He read it. He set it down. You should do this, he said. She looked at him. Do what? Help people with this, formally. There are ranchers all over this territory who don't have someone who knows how to read county filings, who don't understand how to protect their water rights before they lose them. He paused. You could help them the way you helped us. I'm not a lawyer, she said. No, he said. You're better. You're someone who reads everything and talks to people like they're capable of understanding their own situation. She looked at the letter on the desk. She thought about the 2 ranchers at the kitchen table. About the way they had leaned forward as she explained, the way their faces had shifted from overwhelmed to focused, the way one of them had said, halfway through, I didn't know you could look at it that way. Let me think about it, she said. Take your time, he said. She thought about it for approximately 3 days. Then she wrote to Collins and asked him about the practical and legal parameters of what she was considering. And Collins wrote back with more enthusiasm than she expected, and the names of 4 people she should speak to. And that was how Eleanor Callahan began, quietly and without announcement, doing the work that would eventually make her one of the most consulted private advisors on territorial land rights in Montana. Not immediately, not that winter. That winter she was still learning the full shape of the ranch, still building the routines that would carry them through the season. Still finding every morning that there was more to this life than she had known to look for. But the direction was clear. It had been clear, she realized later, since the moment on the train when she had read Grant Callahan's letter for the first time and felt the small, stubborn, dangerous thing we call hope begin to move inside her. She had just not known yet what shape it would take. The letter from Vivian came in December, not Rosalie this time. Vivian, the elder sister, the married one, the one who had sat at the writing desk in the Franklin parlor and penned the letter that had started all of this, and whose voice Eleanor could still hear sometimes in the particular register of cruelty disguised as concern. This letter was different. Eleanor knew it was different from the handwriting, slower than usual, more deliberate, without the decorative loops that characterized Vivian's ordinary correspondence. She opened it at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning while Grant was outside with the men and Samuel was at his lessons, and she read it standing up because she had not decided whether to sit down for it yet. Vivian wrote that she had heard things, that the family had heard things, that the legal battle had been real, that Eleanor had played a significant role in it, that the Helena Commission's decision had apparently been noted in certain circles. She wrote that their mother had cried when she heard. She wrote that their father had said twice, in the way he repeated things he was still processing, that he had not known Eleanor could do things like that. She wrote, "I think we were wrong about you. I think we have always been wrong about you. I do not know if that is something you can forgive or if you want to. I only know it is true, and I thought you should hear it." Eleanor read the letter twice. She stood at the kitchen table and read it twice, and she was aware of the complete absence of the feeling she had expected: the satisfaction, the vindication, the sense of a score settled. None of that was there. What was there instead was something quieter and more complicated. Something that felt more than anything else like tiredness. Not bitterness, just the tiredness of a woman who had spent a long time waiting for something and had finally stopped waiting and now found that its arrival was both too late and, in its own way, still something. She put the letter down. She went to the window. She looked at the yard, at Grant talking to Hat near the barn, at the solid square geometry of the outbuildings, at the frost on the ground and the smoke from the chimney rising straight in the cold, still air. And she thought about Franklin, Missouri, and found that she could do it without pain now. Not without feeling, without pain. Franklin was a place she had come from, not a place that defined her. The people there had seen what they expected to see and missed what was actually there, and that was a failure of their imagination, not a truth about her worth. She had known that for a long time. But knowing it in Montana, standing in her own kitchen, in her own life, with the evidence of it spread out around her in every direction, that was different from knowing it in the Whitmore parlor while her sisters practiced smiling in mirrors. She got her paper, she wrote back, she was brief, she was honest. She said she did not require an apology to live her life, but she accepted Vivian's words in the spirit they appeared to be offered. She said she was well. She said she was more than well. She said the ranch was everything she had hoped, and considerably more than that. She did not say "I told you so." She did not need to. The life she was living said it more completely than any words she could have written. The winter deepened and the ranch settled into itself. And Eleanor learned what it meant to survive a Montana winter, not as an ordeal to be endured, but as a season, with its own demands and its own particular beauties, the kind she did not linger on, but registered in passing, the way you register things that are simply part of where you live. One evening in late January, Grant came in from the barn after the last of the evening checks and found Eleanor at the kitchen table with a lamp and a new set of documents, county filings, she had been asked to review for the Eastern Territory ranchers, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her the way he sometimes looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She was always paying attention. "What?" she said, without looking up. "Nothing," he said. "Grant," he came into the kitchen. He poured himself coffee. He sat down across from her and looked at her over the rim of the cup. "I was thinking about the day you got off the train," he said. She looked up then. "You were nervous," he said. "I could see it." "But you didn't look down." "I was terrified," she said. "I know, I could see that too." He paused. "But you walked straight toward me. You didn't wait to see what I would do." She looked at him for a moment. "You were the only person at the station who looked like they were there to receive someone instead of just passing through." Something moved in his face that was close to a smile. "That's how you recognized me." "That," she said, "and the fact that you looked like a man who was also terrified and also not looking down." He was quiet for a moment. "Were you frightened of me?" he said. "No," she said. "I was frightened of hoping for something and being wrong." That's different from being frightened of a person. He looked at his coffee cup. "Were you wrong?" he said. She looked at him, at this man she had married as a stranger, and had come to know the way you come to know the land you work, not all at once but in layers, in seasons, in the accumulating evidence of daily life, and she felt everything she had built here move through her like the first warm air of spring, moving through a house that has been cold all winter. "No," she said, "I was not wrong." He looked at her with the full, open, unguarded attention that was his most private self, the self he kept for things that mattered most. "Neither was I," he said quietly. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. They stayed like that for a while, two people who had found each other at the end of a long journey that neither of them had known they were on, while the lamp burned and the winter wind moved outside and the ranch held steady around them. The way it always held steady, the way everything they had built together held steady. It was Samuel who said it out loud first, as Samuel usually did in the sideways, unannounced way of a child who had decided something privately and announced it publicly without preamble. It was a Sunday morning in February. Eleanor was making breakfast. Grant was at the table with coffee and the week's accounts. Samuel came downstairs in his boots and his coat already on. He had been up early to check on the kittens, who were now large enough to terrorize the barn with great enthusiasm, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the scene in front of him, with the expression of someone confirming something they already knew. "This is good," he said. Grant looked up from the accounts. Eleanor looked up from the stove. Samuel looked between them. "This," he said, gesturing at the kitchen, at the two of them, at the whole specific ordinary morning of it. "This is what I wanted. This is what I was afraid we wouldn't get." He said it the way he said true things, simply, without decoration, in the voice of a child who had learned that feelings were real, and language was the most precise tool available for handling them. Eleanor turned fully from the stove. She looked at Samuel, at this boy who had been 7 years old and watchful and carrying grief larger than his frame when she arrived, and who was now 8 years old and still watchful and still carrying things, but not alone. Never alone anymore, and she felt something so complete move through her that it had no name. It was too large for a single word. It was the whole of what she had come here for, standing in the kitchen doorway in muddy boots at 8 in the morning, telling her it had been worth it. Every document, every night at the desk, every mile on the train. Every morning she had woken up and showed up and kept going without anyone asking her to, because that was simply who she was. It had been worth it, all of it. "Come here," she said. Samuel crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she pulled him in the way she had learned. He liked to be held matter-of-factly, solidly, without fuss, and she felt his arms go around her with the complete trust of a child who has stopped protecting himself, and she held on, and above Samuel's head, she looked at Grant, who was watching them with an expression she knew now was the most unguarded his face ever went. He looked like a man who had been given back something he had not believed he would ever have again. She held his gaze, she held Samuel close. She thought about Franklin, Missouri, about the woman everyone had called plain, about the joke her sisters had constructed in a parlor on a Tuesday afternoon, about the letter that was supposed to disappear into silence, and instead had changed everything. She thought about what the world had called her. She thought about what she knew herself to be. And she understood, with the absolute clarity of a woman standing in the center of the life she had built with her own hands, her own mind, her own stubborn refusal to become what other people needed her to be. She understood that the two things had never had anything to do with each other. What the world had called her was a story other people wrote about the space she left when they refused to look. What she knew herself to be was what she had proven, every single day, from the moment she stepped off that train and walked straight toward the unknown without looking down. She was Eleanor Callahan. She had saved a ranch, raised a boy who would become a good man, loved a man who deserved to be loved the right way, and built something in the Montana Territory that would outlast every whisper and every laugh and every careful cruelty that had ever been directed at the plain daughter of the Whitmore family. She had not been rescued. She had not been transformed. She had simply finally been somewhere large enough to hold who she already was. And that was everything. That was always going to be enough.